This is History of Sexuality in the U.S. Lecture 5A, Part 2, talking about the idea of the new normal. This is a term that really took off after the September 11th, 2001 attacks, in which a lot of things started changing in U.S. culture, and people started talking about the new normal. An acknowledgement that normal is not a trans-historical stable idea, but rather something that shifts and changes with context. The new normal, though it initially had these connotations about security and terrorism, quickly became applied more commonly to thinking about some of the changes that were going on in sexuality, and specifically in reference to lesbian, gay, and bisexual rights. A really key factor in all of this was the decision Lawrence v. Texas, decided by the Supreme Court in 2003. This was a reversal of that 1986 Bowers v. Hardwick decision, and Lawrence strikes down all of the Texas anti-sodomy laws, as well as remaining laws that criminalized oral and anal sex across the country. A number of states remained kind of regulating really strictly, considering it a felony for two consenting adults to have non-vaginal sex with each other. And this was something that was a really sudden reversal in some ways. Now, we remember perhaps the way that Brown v. Board of Education undid that decision back from 1896 that enshrines segregation in Plessy versus Ferguson, right? It takes 60 years or so for the Supreme Court to reverse themselves. But they reversed themselves entirely, right, in 17 years. And that tells us that a lot was happening really quickly during this moment. Despite all those anti-gay laws passed in the 90s, we can see that a cultural shift was happening. And whereas a majority of the court ruled that you had no right to privacy if you were having sex with someone of the same sex, then we see 17 years later in 2003, they say no. That right to privacy applies to private, consensual sexual relations between all adults. This decision then gives birth to two other important Supreme Court decisions that might be familiar to you. U.S. versus Windsor and Obergefell versus Hodges. U.S. versus Windsor strikes down that Defense of Marriage Act, that national definition of marriage as one man and one woman. And Obergefell goes even further, striking down the state-level bans and making it so that in all 50 states, same-sex marriage is a legal possibility. This is also accompanied by a move to enshrine hate crimes legislation, and especially in the 2009 Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. Most hate crimes legislation seeks to address anti-gay violence by creating what's called a sentencing enhancement. It's a lengthening of the sentence you would receive if you're convicted of a crime and the jury determines that the crime was motivated by bias, by hatred or discrimination against a particular group. Proponents say that this is a good way for the government to show it's on the side of gay and lesbian people and to say that they take that violence seriously. But critics say that hate crimes legislation increases the total amount of incarceration in society, makes it so that people are behind bars for longer. And we can also see that these laws are sometimes turned against gay people, people of color, and people from different marginalized groups when they have a conflict with people from dominant groups. Combined with, and thinking about marriage, thinking about hate crimes legislation, thinking about the military, that we'll talk a little more in part 3 about, Lisa Dugan labeled what we're seeing in the 90s and 2000s as the new homonormativity, a type of gay and lesbian politics that doesn't contest dominant norms, but rather seeks inclusion into them. So rather than questioning the institution of marriage and questioning why Edith Windsor deserved to inherit so much of her wife's wealth without paying taxes to the federal government, which is what Windsor's case was about, right? It was about her economic privilege as well as the discrimination against her on her sexuality. Well, Dugan says that we're seeing a demobilization as some people are able to assimilate and other people, especially trans people, low-income queer people of color, are pushed out. Jasbir Puar took homonormativity even further, and she said we can see a rise after September 11th of homo-nationalism, a confluence of militaristic nationalism and gay and lesbian identity. Maybe you've seen the updated version of the kiss from the end of World War II, with the two lesbians kissing as one of them returns from service in Iraq. This allows for U.S. militarism to be turned into a scene of romantic love, and one that also proposes that the United States is pro-women's rights and pro-gay rights, despite this long and disturbing history. And that connects very importantly to the next video, where I'm going to talk more about the war on terror.